News, politics, and lifestyle show. I'd like to welcome GoLocal regular Jennifer Lawless at American University. Thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
Well, great time to be talking about national politics and the reaction inside the Beltway to President Donald Trump's meeting with Kim Jong-un and what transpired. What are folks saying?
I think both parties are somewhat stunned by what happened. Not only in that Donald Trump basically gave something away and didn't get anything back, but also because of the way that Trump treated Kim Jong-un, especially relative to the way that he treated Justin Trudeau, which we can talk about in a minute. But I mean, the relationship in general and the way that they greeted one another and the body language and the patting on the arm and just the overall demeanor was that which we would typically reserved for our allies, not, an enemy or at least a hostile power that has engaged in human rights abuses. And so I think both Democrats and Republicans are a little perturbed by the fact that Trump didn't use this opportunity to express disfavor toward the way the North Korean regime has conducted itself.
So let's talk a little bit about that, where they sort of came together on issues. Now, we've heard that talking about the ending of those summer exercises with South Korea. We've seen North Korea agree to do denuclearization. Is this an even deal?
No, for two reasons. The first is, as Trump calls them war games, the South Koreans had no idea that this was even on the table or that this was going to be something that was discussed, which suggests that it's not a done deal because it involves a third party and Trump hadn't spoken to them. The second is the denuclearization that North Korea apparently agreed to is incredibly vague and amorphous. It's unclear what measurable steps are going to be taken. It's unclear how it's going to be monitored. And it's also unclear what the timetable is. So I don't think that most people who are assessing the deal, if we can call it that, really would believe that it's bilateral in nature.
Got to talk about Dennis Rodman. Where does he end up in the pages of history?
I've got to say that as I was watching the Dennis Rodman interview last night, I initially felt like, are we kidding with this? But then I was watching CNN and I was watching MSNBC, and all of the political analysts on there and all of the former national security people said that he really gets it, and he really gets the way that Kim Jong-un thinks, and he has a better idea about what's going on in North Korea than many of us would. And he's also probably the only person who has had personal contact and a real relationship with both Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. And so it's somewhat bizarre, but I think that he actually will go down in history as at least playing an initial role in beginning to open U.S. relations with the North Koreans.
So, as you said, you don't think it's an even deal. You question where South Korea is going to be now after Trump saying that the war games are now no more. What now?
Well, I think we have to see what the actual document looks like and what the deliverables are. So it's one thing to walk away from a half-day summit and say, we had a great meeting, we have a lot of stuff on the table, and we're going to implement it, and actually seeing what the terms are and how it can be executed and how it can be measured. We also know, if you look at some of the quotes issued by Donald Trump over the course of the last 24 hours, that he would not be at all surprised if this fizzles and dissolves, because he doesn't know who he's dealing with, and he hasn't been in a position to negotiate with somebody like Kim Jong-un before. So, I think in 2 or 3 days we'll have a better sense, in a week we'll have a better sense, and maybe even a month from now. At this point, it's certainly goodwill, and we're a lot further away from nuclear war than we were a few months ago, but I'm not sure that we're that much closer to peace.
So, very foreign relations heavy show today. We usually focus much more on domestic policy, but this is really what's in the news right now. We have to talk about the G7 and Justin Trudeau. Just earlier today, Peter Navarro did apologize for saying that there is a special place in hell for Justin Trudeau.
I mean, if you would have told me when Donald Trump became president that our biggest enemies and the most strife that we would have on a foreign policy basis was with Canada, I would have said that that was not believable. But Donald Trump has managed to alienate and isolate Canada and Justin Trudeau, and he's done it in a way that he typically reserves for his members of his own administration or the United States Congress, right? And so in some ways, he feels comfortable enough to call him weak and to make fun of him and to suggest that he's dishonest. None of those tweets looks much different than the way he's described Jeff Sessions or other members of his cabinet. The difference, of course, is that Justin Trudeau is a head of state who is very well respected by the other G6. And so that puts Donald Trump in a little bit of shakier footing, at least in terms of being able to deliver on any of his threats toward Trudeau.
So why pick on Trudeau? Why Canada?
I mean, I think a couple of reasons. The first is that Trudeau is, I think Donald Trump thinks that he can be portrayed as somewhat weak. And the juxtaposition between Trudeau and Kim Jong-un is pretty substantial, right? Trudeau is seen as this progressive, feminist, forward-thinking, much beloved head of state. And Kim Jong-un is the opposite of that. And I think that it's possible that there was some signaling going on. And, Trump was suggesting that he's pretty powerful and that he can tell other heads of state what he thinks. Of course, he picked somebody that he perceived as pretty weak to do it at a time where he was then jetting off to meet somebody that he clearly respects. I mean, he said that Kim Jong-un was very, very talented. And when you think about what Kim Jong-un has managed to do, it's probably not the word talent that most people would use to describe it.
So let's talk a little bit as well. Things don't happen necessarily in a vacuum, not that they're related, but oftentimes when we talk about the Korean Peninsula, I've spoken with Naval War College expert Terrence Roehrig about the theater, about the role of the Chinese. Speaking of the Chinese, a report by the Washington Post last Friday that the Naval Undersea Warfare Center right here in Newport had a contractor hacked by the Chinese. We're finding a little bit more information coming out. They're definitely not talking a lot. Does this surprise you? And, what should we be asking for answers here in Rhode Island?
Well, I think it speaks to a much broader phenomenon, which is this general sense that foreign nations can intervene not only in domestic politics, but also in the way that the United States conducts its foreign affairs. This is a situation similar to Russia interfering in our elections. Now you've got China potentially getting information and interfering in submarine warfare tactics and the manner in which we would conduct ourselves. And I think it highlights that the longer we go on, sort of quibbling Donald Trump versus everybody else about whether the Russians hacked our elections, whether they interfered, whether foreign influence and influence from abroad is shaping the way that we're conducting our policies, the more vulnerable we are to hackers, whether they be Russian or Chinese or anybody else. Because until the president is willing to step back and say, look, we have a problem here and we need to protect our information across all realms and all domains, this kind of stuff is going to continue to happen. Now, the good news, I think, about this situation is that there doesn't seem to be any denial yet from the White House or the administration that this happened. And the Congress is already, and Jack Reed is already calling for more information and investigations. But, I think this is part of a much broader picture.
So do we not expect, as we always like to say, looking forward, we have not, I don't believe, heard anything from the Trump administration because, let's be honest, this does not pertain to elections or Mueller or anything happening on that front. We did see here U.S. Senate candidate Bob Flanders say should be imposing sanctions on China. Do we just not see this bubbling up to the level of political debate just by lieu of the fact that it wasn't involved with American politics per se, but a sliver of the American military?
I think we don't know everything we need to know yet, but I wouldn't say that ultimately that's not the right move to pursue. I just think that we need to have a better sense of information, and we also need to see how it's linked to other things. Like, is this a one-off? Is this something that's been going on longer and we didn't know? Are there other ways that this is happening or in other domains or in other realms? So I think we're at the beginning of really being able to understand how big a problem this is, but certainly it's one that needs to be addressed. The fact that it's not linked to the elections or that it's not linked to Russia is probably a good news because it gives the Congress a better opportunity to investigate without interference from the White House suggesting that it's politically motivated.
We'll continue to keep an eye on that moving forward. Woo, so much foreign politics here. Let's come domestic. There's some elections today.
There are. Virginia is, I think, the most important one today. So in Virginia's 10th congressional district, Barbara Comstock, who is a Republican member of Congress, is facing a probably pretty easy primary, but in the Democratic primary against her, she's facing 4 progressive women and 1 progressive man. It's likely that whoever wins that race has a very, very good shot at winning her seat. And so, this is one of those bellwether districts where Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, aren't necessarily the gauge that we can use, because Clinton outperformed Trump here and Comstock still held the seat. So, this is one of those races where we need to see how much energy there is and how much enthusiasm there is among voters turning out for the Democratic versus the Republican primary.
South Carolina, any surprises in the works?
I mean, the only really interesting thing there is that Mark Sanford, who we might recall when he was governor, went missing when he was actually with his mistress in Argentina. He said he was hiking the Appalachian Trail. He, for the first time in 3 terms, is actually facing a primary opponent. And it's the first time in 5 years that he spent even $1 on his own reelection campaign. So that highlights that there really is this Trump effect. On both sides of the aisle, more and more people are saying, you know what, this might be my time. And he, by all means, we would consider him a very conservative Republican. He's being framed as a loosey-goosey moderate and as not willing to stand up and defend Donald Trump from his Republican opponent who's running all the way to his right. So I think that sort of foreshadows what we might expect in some of these very, very red districts.
So before we let you go, Jennifer, we do have to ask you, we have parsed the latest poll from GoLocal down to its finest point. It was released last Thursday with John Della Volpe taking a snapshot in time here. And the question I want to ask you is the head-to-head of a Joe Trillo, Alan Fung, Gina Raimondo shows Fung and Raimondo in a dead heat at about 33% apiece, 18% undecided, 16% to Joe Trillo. What do you think of these numbers?
I think that it's very, very good news for Alan Fung. I also noticed that in the head-to-head, Alan Fung knocks off Matt Brown by an even bigger margin, right? So this is the worst case scenario for Fung, would be, Raimondo winning the primary. The fact that we've got the 18%, assuming that at the end of the day, Fung makes the case that if those Trillo voters cast votes for Trillo, it's going to generate a Raimondo reelection. That's a pretty compelling argument to get them not to do so. And so Fung, I think, has the upper hand. Trillo would be the spoiler for Fung, but I think it's a pretty easy argument for Fung to make. So if I were in the Fung campaign today, I would think that that's not a terrible place to be.
Well, as always, appreciate your taking the time to let us pick your brain on all things politics. It's been a very busy news cycle. Jennifer Lawless, we appreciate, as always, having you here at the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center.
My pleasure.
Okay, thanks so much. Don't go anywhere. We're going to let Jennifer be. We're going to welcome our next guest here into the studio.